Have you ever felt like you're being haunted, not by ghosts or spirits from the outside world, but by something far more subtle, more intimate, and more persistent? Something that quietly stirs in the silence of your most vulnerable moments. Something that whispers through your self-doubt, sabotages your dreams, and tightens its grip just when you begin to reach for something better. It is not the world that holds you back, not truly. Not the economy, not your parents, not your partner, not even your past in the way you often tell yourself. What shackles you most is something buried beneath your own skin, something that lives inside the very core of your identity. A force Carl Jung described not as evil, but as ignored, a hidden realm of your psyche that you pretend doesn't exist, the shadow. And the truth is, whether you acknowledge it or not, your shadow is alive. It speaks through your silence, acts through your hesitation, and flourishes in every moment you choose comfort over confrontation, denial over honesty, and blame over self-inquiry. You cannot destroy it. You cannot outrun it. You cannot positive think your way past it. The more you suppress it, the more it finds clever, camouflaged ways to direct your life, while you go on believing that you are the one in control. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And those are not poetic words meant to decorate a book cover. They're a warning. A precise diagnosis of what happens when a human being refuses to face the parts of themselves they fear, despise, or do not understand. Because what you repress doesn't die. It accumulates, it mutates, it waits. The shadow is the place within you where all the unacceptable parts were sent into exile. Your jealousy, your rage, your desires that didn't fit the mold, your ambitions that others ridiculed, your capacity to hate, to dominate, to demand, to grieve, to feel uncontrollably. Every time you were told, "Don't cry, don't be selfish, don't be angry," you began building the architecture of your own shadow. And while it may have helped you survive socially, emotionally, even physically, because adaptation was necessary, the cost is that you created a version of yourself that is only half the truth. So now, when you stand in front of a mirror and wonder why you feel incomplete, why you can't seem to change certain habits, why you always attract the same kind of pain in different disguises, you are not looking at yourself. You are looking at the carefully curated version of yourself, the one you constructed to be loved, accepted, admired, and ultimately trapped. Because here's the paradox: what you hide controls you. You may believe that you're being a good person by suppressing your anger, but that repressed anger leaks through your sarcasm, your passive aggressiveness, your chronic anxiety, or your inability to say no without guilt. You might think you've outgrown your childhood wounds, but the way you overachieve, overthink, or overcompensate is often nothing more than a grown-up version of the same child still begging to be seen. You may not think you're envious, but the bitterness you feel when someone else succeeds is the shadow reminding you that your own desire was never fully owned, and so you attack it in others because you've buried it in yourself. And still, we resist. We resist going inward because we're terrified of what we might find. We resist introspection because it often feels like disloyalty to the self-image we've spent decades constructing. We resist the idea that we have a dark side because we confuse darkness with evil, when in truth, the shadow is not inherently malevolent. It is simply unloved, unspoken, and misunderstood. To ignore the shadow is to let a child run wild in the dark, believing they are alone, unloved, and unworthy, while their cries echo in your adulthood in the form of ruined relationships, sabotaged opportunities, and a life that feels like it's on loop. And so, life becomes repetitive. You notice yourself falling into the same arguments, drawn to the same toxic dynamics, paralyzed by the same fears, plagued by the same inner critic that sounds so convincing that it has begun to resemble your own voice. You don't realize it, but you're not living your life. You're reliving your wounds. The shadow is not just a concept, it is a system of psychological patterns that can dominate your entire existence if left unchecked. But Carl Jung did not speak of the shadow to condemn you. He spoke of it to liberate you. Because there is something else he knew, that within your shadow lies not only your repressed pain, but your repressed power. That rage you buried might be the source of your courage. That jealousy you feel might be a map to your truest desires. That arrogance you judge in others might be the confidence you've denied yourself. The shadow is not the enemy, it is the key. But how do we face it? Not by analyzing it with intellect alone, not by reading a book and thinking we've done the work. No, facing the shadow is a process of deep, uncomfortable, and often painful honesty. It begins when you stop blaming the world and start asking, what am I refusing to see in myself? It begins when you get curious about the parts of yourself you've always labeled as bad, wrong, or not me. It begins when you trace your emotional triggers not to external events, but to internal truths. When you admit that your explosive anger is not just about traffic, that your envy is not just about someone else's success, that your exhaustion is not just about work, but about a lifetime of pretending to be someone you are not. It begins when you stopped lying to yourself. And as you begin this journey, something strange happens. You begin to reclaim yourself. You begin to feel whole, not perfect, but whole. You begin to stand differently in the world, not because your problems vanish, but because you're no longer controlled by the ghost of who you thought you needed to be. You realize that facing your shadow does not make you less human. It makes you real. Because what is authenticity if not the integration of all that you are, the light and the dark, the known and the unknown, the noble and the shameful? And the irony of it all is this: when you integrate your shadow, you become someone truly trustworthy. Not because you are flawless, but because you are no longer afraid of your flaws. You are no longer living a life dictated by avoidance, denial, and projection. You become someone others can feel safe with. Not because you say all the right things, but because you have stopped hiding from yourself. Carl Jung believed that the greatest task of any human being is individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated person. And there is no individuation without the shadow. There is no healing without the hurt, no peace without the confrontation of inner war. You cannot walk forward if you're still dragging the weight of everything you refuse to see. So if you find yourself stuck, lost, angry, afraid, or empty, don't just look outward. Don't just change your job, your relationship, your habits. Look inward. Ask yourself what parts of you have been banished to the basement of your being. Ask yourself why you are so afraid of yourself. And then, slowly, gently, bring light to those places. Because if you do, if you are willing to sit with discomfort, to listen to the parts of you that have gone unheard for too long, to embrace the very things you once disowned, then the shadow will no longer have to haunt you. It will guide you. It will become your teacher, your ally, your compass. And you will finally begin not just to exist, but to live.
The journey toward integrating the shadow is not a single moment of revelation or a tidy breakthrough that occurs under soft lighting and peaceful music. It is a long, winding descent into the forgotten corridors of your own soul, where the echoes of things unsaid, unloved, and unresolved still linger in silence, waiting not to be erased, but to be acknowledged, felt, and finally brought into the light of awareness, without judgment, without shame, and without the illusion that healing means erasure. You will not come back from this journey the same, not because you will have discarded what was bad within you, but because you will have reclaimed what was once lost, exiled, or distorted by fear. Your ability to feel deeply without censorship, to desire without apology, to be angry without destruction, to know yourself as both fragile and powerful, kind and cruel, sacred and flawed, because wholeness was never about purity, but about integration. There will be moments when you resist, when the old defenses rise like familiar ghosts whispering that it's safer to stay numb, to stay busy, to stay distracted, because anything, even emptiness, is easier than staring into the mirror that reveals not only the wounds you carry, but the responsibility you have to no longer blame others for how they shaped you, and instead begin the sacred task of reshaping yourself with both compassion and accountability. The process will challenge everything you have built on the foundation of your persona, your carefully curated identity, your achievements designed to prove your worth, your social masks that earned you approval but cost you authenticity. Because to bring the shadow into the light, you must let go of the false self you once believed was necessary for love and survival. And yet, what you will find, paradoxically, is that the more you embrace your own darkness, the more you become capable of light. Not a brittle, performative brightness meant to impress others or keep them comfortable, but a quiet, unwavering radiance that comes from being rooted in truth. A light that does not flicker in the face of judgment, rejection, or chaos, because it is not built on pretense but on presence. You will start to notice the subtle shifts, the way your anger no longer owns you but becomes a signal that a boundary has been crossed, the way your envy softens into admiration and becomes a compass pointing to your own unlived potential, the way your fear transforms from paralysis into vigilance, guiding you not away from life but toward the edges where growth begins. Relationships begin to change, not because others suddenly become more kind or less flawed, but because your projections begin to dissolve, and where you once saw enemies or saviors, you now see mirrors, invitations, teachers, and tests. And slowly, as the patterns break, as the old cycles lose their grip, you realize that freedom was never about controlling the external world, but about freeing yourself from the invisible contracts you made with your pain. Carl Jung understood something many people still fail to grasp, that the shadow is not an inconvenience or a flaw in human design, but a doorway to our deepest healing, a portal to the lost treasures of the psyche that were buried under trauma, culture, family dynamics, and the desperate need to belong in a world that often asks us to be less than whole in order to be accepted. It is no small task to walk this path, to peer into the parts of yourself that you have spent a lifetime denying, to hold space for the shame, the bitterness, the cruelty, the unmet hunger, and not flinch, not collapse into self-loathing or flee into the arms of spiritual bypassing, but to remain present, curious, and grounded as you slowly retrieve the pieces of your soul you once left behind. And as you continue this work, this sacred, soul-deep work of integration, you begin to see the shadow not as a curse, but a gift, wrapped in the most difficult wrapping. A reminder that within the darkest parts of your nature lies the fuel for your awakening, the raw material for your purpose, and the very essence of your humanity. Because to know your shadow is to become unshakable, not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer so easily thrown off course by the unexpected, the painful, or the unfamiliar, having already made peace with those things within yourself. You are no longer fragmented and reactive, but whole and responsive, anchored in a self that includes every facet, not only the socially acceptable, but the beautifully broken, the fiercely passionate, the misunderstood, the bold, and the unseen. And in that wholeness, there is power. Not the brittle power of dominance or control, but the quiet power of someone who knows themselves deeply, who can stand in their truth without needing to prove it, who can speak from the heart without needing to be right, who can love others fully without losing themselves in the process. This is the paradox Jung invites us into, that by facing what we fear most in ourselves, we become free. By embracing the very traits we once rejected, we become more human, not less. And by making space for the shadow, we expand our capacity not only for depth, but also for joy, intimacy, and meaningful transformation. To ignore your shadow is to live as a ghost in your own life, trapped in the same cycles, blaming the same external forces, wondering why nothing ever truly changes, no matter how many self-help books you read or affirmations you recite, because no amount of surface-level positivity can compensate for the power of what lies unresolved in the basement of your being. But to confront your shadow is to walk the most difficult path with the most beautiful reward, the chance to become whole, to feel alive in every corner of your psyche, and to know that your darkness does not make you unworthy, it makes you real. And so perhaps the question is no longer, how do I avoid my shadow, but rather, what wisdom have I been missing by running from it? Because in the end, the shadow is not what destroys you, denying it is.